Again.
Well, thank you, Rick. We're going to talk about the title, Could Texas Become the Largest Solar Opportunity in the World, and an update on the ERCOT resource adequacy situation, but we're going to do it backwards. We're going to start with the ERCOT resource adequacy situation, and then we'll talk some about solar. First, let's talk a little bit about the ERCOT system, just some brief facts. The ERCOT system is about 85% of Texas, not all of it, shown here on the right in the blue, the darker blue. It's about, again, 85% of the population and 85% of the area of Texas. Notice in the left drawing that the major transmission routes run from east to west, or west to east, as the case might be, and north to south. So those are the major transmission lines that connect the load centers to the generation capability in Texas. And the major load centers are Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, and Corpus Christi. And if you look at the map, you'll see that all those cities are connected by these main transmission maps shown in red. ERCOT is about 200,000 square miles in size, with about 40,500 miles of transmission this year, and we've been building a lot of transmission lately, so that has increased. The peak capacity, that is the ability to produce power within ERCOT, is about 74,000 megawatts. 10,000 of that is wind generation. There's actually more than 10,000 megawatts in Texas, but only 10,000 megawatts or so is in ERCOT. The rest is outside of the ERCOT system. Our all-time peak load was 66,500 and some megawatts in the summer of 2000, and that's summer of 2000. And well, I'm sorry, the 66,548 is the 2012 number, and we actually had a peak of 1,746 megawatts higher than that in 2011, which was the hottest summer on record in Texas and the highest peak load we've ever had. So it's around 68,200, actually 68,300 megawatts in 2011. Our target reserve margin, that is the amount of power that is available in excess of what's being used on the peak, that at the highest point of use during the year, is 13.75%. That's to cover for contingencies such as a transmission line loss or the loss of a large power plant. In 2012, this previous summer, the peak reserve margin was only 8.9%, and prior to that, in 2011, again, the hottest year that we've had, the reserve margin at peak was only 7.6%, so quite a bit less. ERCOT has some nominal connection to the rest of the U.S., but very, very nominal. Essentially, ERCOT is an isolated system about the size of the system in the United Kingdom. Shown here are the approximate locations of all of the high voltage direct current ties between the Texas Interconnection in pink, the Eastern Interconnection in blue, and the Western Interconnection. Actually, there are no ties with the Western Interconnection, but it's shown in green, and then with Mexico in pink. We have about 1,100 megawatts total capability between the ERCOT system, the Eastern Interconnect, and Mexico. And again, that's on a system of the size of 74,000 megawatts. So the interconnection capability is relatively small, and it's all at direct current instead of alternating current. A comparison here on the capacity situation, installed capacity in 2011 and 2012. It's about the same. We had a few retirements between 2011 and 2012, and that's why it's down just a bit. But you notice one key feature here is that the wind power is 13%, and hydro, biomass, and other includes solar, is only about 1%. But the mix has not changed a good bit from the standpoint of capacity between 2011 and 2012. Again, solar capacity is included, but it's only about 1/10 of 1%, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. From a generation standpoint, that is an energy standpoint, how much did those facilities produce? There is a reasonably substantial change between 2011 and 2012. First of all, the total energy in 2012 was 3% lower than 2011, but again, 2011 was the hottest year on record. The majority of generation capacity is natural gas fueled, and the amount of energy produced by natural gas plants was about the same as the energy produced by coal in 2011. However, In 2012, natural gas generation was considerably higher due to low gas prices and seasonal operation of some coal plants. That is, because of gas prices, some coal plants actually shut down, and those entities used gas instead, not in those plants, but bought gas from other suppliers, gas generation. This trend is expected to continue. Less coal, more natural gas, as long as natural gas prices remain low. Again, wind, if you remember from the previous slide, we'll go back there real quickly, that wind produced what was 13% of capacity. However, it only produced 9% of energy. And that's largely due to the lack of synergy with load and uncontrollability, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. This is the latest ERCOT reserve margin chart. Actually, this is created from the numbers in ERCOT. This chart was created out from those numbers. This is the December 2012 Capacity Demand Reserves Report. And you can see that even in this coming summer, 2013, that the reserve margin is projected to be below the target of 13.75. And you can see it drops off significantly after that, down to 2.8% out in 2022. The target reserve margin is intended to ensure reliability during loss of generation or transmission events, and the 13.75 is typical for similar electric systems in the U.S. The rapidly shrinking projected reserve margins, along with the reliability challenges experienced back in the summer of 2011 when we had our hottest year, have led the Public Utility Commission to start discussions about resource adequacy and how to provide the financial incentives for entities to build new generation to supply the needs going forward. One other comparison of the reserve margins, ERCOT puts out a capacity demand reserve report every 6 months or so, one in May generally, and then one in December. So these are the last two reports that have come out, and you can see that from May 2012 to December 2012, that the reliability situation or the reserve situation improved a bit, except for 2013 when it's just below the target. But it's pretty close to the target. But in other years, it improved. What has happened since that? Well, we had about 900 megawatts of units that were mothballed. They were taken out of service for economic reasons. These are generally old gas units, gas-fired units. 2,360 megawatts were either canceled or suspended. Coal, pet coke, that made up about 1,900 megawatts of it. And then a 400-megawatt wind project was canceled, as well as a 60-megawatt solar project that was deferred. But there were 2,305 megawatts of new units added. 1,300, most of it wind, 1,300 megawatts of wind, a gas unit, actually one coal unit, 240 megawatt clean coal energy. Interestingly enough, a 36 megawatt battery storage facility was added out in West Texas. And Sherryland has decided to add a 150 megawatt DC tie to Mexico. They already have a 150 megawatt DC tie, and they're going to expand that to 300 megawatts. And then another difference was there are 266 megawatts in unit D ratings, that units that don't produce as much power as they thought. So except for 2013, the reserve margin situation has improved due to a significant a reduction in forecast load growth over the period, about 5,100 megawatts over this 9-year period, offset somewhat by a reduction in the forecast available generation, about 2,350. Note that there are no solar projects under advanced development. So what do those reserve margins mean? Well, ERCOT average load growth from 2013 to 2022, that 9-year period that we just looked at, is about 2% per year, or about 1,300 megawatts. To put that in perspective, that's one large nuclear plant each year, or 2 large coal plants each year, or 2 or 3 combined cycle plants each year, natural gas fired, depending on how big those natural gas plants are. So it's significant. So to keep up with the load growth, we need to have some mix of these new plants, and obviously we will talk about this in a minute, but we can also use other resources as well. The reason that there's such significant load growth is because we have a good economy. There's a booming oil and natural gas business, especially in West Texas. Our population is growing, and air conditioning demand has always been large in Texas. So why is there this potential shortage? Why aren't people building power plants to supply this? Well, the current low natural gas price environment discourages new investment because the plants are just simply economic, and gas prices are forecast to remain relatively low. Demand growth just makes the capacity problem worse. Prices in the energy-only market, which is what we have in ERCOT, an energy-only market, have not been allowed to rise to levels that would incent the financing and construction of new power plants. In other words, gas prices are low. The power prices are basically pegged to gas prices, and those gas prices and power prices do not support the construction of new plants. Texas has experienced and is expected to continue to experience robust load growth, again, over 2% a year, but almost 4% in 2014 and 5% in 2015, so some significant load growth. So what's being done about it? Who's doing what? And here we can see some of the things that the Public Utility Commission has done. The Public Utility Commission has been involved in this issue since the capacity shortfall issue in 2011, since we had the hot year. And while there have been major changes, or some changes to address the shorter-term issues, a solution to the longer-term capacity problem has not been developed. You can see here that the maximum hourly price in the balancing energy market will be increased as shown here, but this is just a small part of the energy market in ERCOT, but a significant increase in the prices. These caps have been as low as $500 in the past, and most recently $3,000. So this is a significant move upward. Almost 2,000 megawatts of mothball capacity has been recalled in the last couple of years, last couple of summers, and it can be recalled again and likely will be recalled this summer. Demand response is seen as a vehicle to reduce demand during peak period, and as a matter of fact, just this morning, the Public Utility Commission was holding a workshop on demand response, and so we will hope to hear some results from that, although I suspect they're just continuing to study the issue. Ancillary services, which are capacity related, are being priced at more attractive levels, and this just encourages people to build peaking capacity primarily. So ancillary services, well, I don't want to go into the details of ancillary services. I can if you ask a question about them, but these also assist or aid customers or aid developers in pricing or in finding enough revenue from their projects to build especially peaking units. And then the last one is almost a self-explanatory. Peaker net margin is a sum of all differences between the clearing price in the ERCOT retail energy market and the estimated marginal cost of operating a peaker with a heat rate of 10,000 BTU per kilowatt hour. And in short, the peaker net margin moved up from $175,000 per year up to $300,000 per year. And so that should encourage the development of more peaking capacity. Well, that's not all the Public Utility Commission is thinking about, though. They're thinking about revising the reserve margin target, making it mandatory versus voluntary, which it is at this point, or just a target. But a mandatory reserve margin would create a capacity market. We would no longer have a strict energy market, and it would require load-serving entities, that is retail electric providers, to contract for reserves. And this would be a problem for some of those load-serving entities because of the credit required to contract for those reserves. So will that happen? Well, it's being considered by the Public Utility Commission. They're also considering changing the wind reliability factor. Let me explain that. Wind has been counted as only 8% reliable. That is, if you have 100 megawatts of wind power, only 8.7% of it is counted toward that reserve margin or is counted as being reliable. That's simply because it is uncontrollable and to some extent unreliable because of that. But because ERCOT has learned to deal with the wind, they have thought about or considering moving that from 8.7 to 14.2% for the West Texas wind, and then 8.7% to 32.9% from the coastal wind. Coastal wind blows more constantly and therefore has a higher capacity value. By doing that, they would add some almost 925 megawatts of reliable capacity to the system, which would alleviate to some extent that reserve margin issue. It adds about 1.4% to the reserve margin. So at 10%, again, it would be 11.4. So it will improve. Now, solar power, interestingly, is counted at 100% from a reliability standpoint, but that's because there's so little of it. There's only less than 100 megawatts of solar operating in ERCOT, and when that reaches 200 megawatts, then ERCOT will have to develop a reliability factor for wind as well, and we'll see some numbers on that in just a moment. Commissioner Anderson, one of the three commissioners, actually there's only two commissioners now because one of the commissioners has just recently resigned March 1st, so there are just two. But Commissioner Anderson, his comments assume that all mothballed generation that can be returned within 6 months will be returned, and that 2,140 megawatts of new generation not included in the latest ERCOT capacity demand reserve report will be brought into service, and that the wind reliability factor will be increased as we just talked about. And he says if that happens, ERCOT won't have a reserve margin problem until 2018. That's his opinion. Now, Commissioner Anderson is not necessarily in favor of a capacity market, and so that essentially it argues that point that you really don't need a capacity market. The operating reserve demand curve that is being talked about right now would price certain ancillary services at progressively higher levels depending upon the amount of scarcity, in other words, the amount of need, and the value and probability of lost load. So again, that's kind of a detailed issue, but Chairman Nelson does not want to implement the operating reserve demand curve process, which is sort of the popular thing that they're talking about now, until it is fully studied, and it's unlikely that anything will be developed or anything will be done with the operating reserve demand curve prior to this summer. Okay. So where do we go from here? Well, there will be more PUC workshops, and there'll be more studies, and there'll be more deliberation. And due to the relatively mild summer of 2012 and the lack of challenges to the system as a result, there just doesn't seem to be a burning platform that mandates a quick solution. The Texas legislature is meeting right now. It meets every other year and between January and May, and is in session right now and could address the capacity issue. But in my opinion, it's not likely that a bill will come out of the legislature that will address this issue. But in my opinion, a long-term capacity market of some sort, whether it be requiring retail electric providers to provide their reserves or some other form, is likely over the long term, because history shows that the energy market will not be allowed to function as designed. That is, it requires too much patience, and as prices rise, then there is the tendency to manipulate the market, which is what has happened in the past. But it seems to me there are other things we could do to help resolve the situation. So let's talk about those for a moment. This comes from ERCOT's long-term assessment for the ERCOT region. This is done it's a scenario event done for a variety of reasons, among them transmission and also resource adequacy. But it looks at the long-range forecast for ERCOT, and in that latest report in December 2012, this statement appeared. So it says that natural gas, wind, and solar resources will constitute the majority of new resources over the next 10 years or so. Now, let's look at one of the scenarios. Now, I want to caution that this is one scenario from ERCOT's long-term assessment. It's not the only scenario. But this one indicates coal will continue to be the largest generation source, with wind and combined cycle natural gas following closely behind. But in this scenario, you'll note that solar generation is just over 2,300 megawatts, 3% of the total. That would imply adding an additional 250 megawatts of solar over the next over the next 9 years, and 250 megawatts per year over the next 9 years, which is an annual growth rate of over 60% a year. Well, what would enable that? Why would that happen? 60% per year, 250 megawatts. Well, you may have seen this information before. Texas is one of the leading states in solar intensity, and that intensity is greatest in West Texas. So solar energy, while it may not represent a complete solution at this time, could certainly help, and in a big way. And let's see how big that big way could be. Interestingly, the transmission system from West Texas, where a lot of the wind power is currently being upgraded to move more wind power from that region to the load centers in Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, Houston area. Those competitive renewable energy zone transmission line projects are projected to cost more than $7 billion, and are scheduled for completion at the end of this year. It'll provide the capacity to move about 18,000 megawatts of power from the wind zones in West Texas and in the Panhandle to the load centers in Texas. But while it's built primarily to ease the movement of wind power from West Texas, these upgrades will benefit solar development in West Texas as well, because the solar areas are also in West Texas. So it is a boon for solar in addition to a boon for wind. Now, what's the potential for solar in Texas? Well, this study comes from the National Renewable Energy Lab, and it's a relatively recent study, last fall. Recall that the peak in 2011 in ERCOT was about 68,000 megawatts, which is 68 gigawatts, and that we had about 74,000 gigawatts of generating capacity, or 74,000 megawatts, or 73 gigawatts of generation capacity. Well, the NREL study shows that 154 gigawatt solar potential for Texas urban areas. That's the cities, which is over twice the current generation capacity in ERCOT. Now, this next slide is really amazing. For the U.S., you can see that Texas is a significant part of the solar capability. So the potential in the rural areas of Texas is a whopping 20,000 gigawatts. That is 20,000 as compared to the capacity of ERCOT of 74 gigawatts, 20,000 to 74. Over 300 times the current capacity in ERCOT is the potential in rural areas of Texas for solar. No, it's not a mistake. 300 times the current capacity in ERCOT. So both the urban and the rural solar PV potentials are the highest of any state, and it appears that there's a significant advantage of being large and having lots of sunshine, at least as far as solar PV is concerned. Now, again, reference the ERCOT peak load of 68 gigawatts. If one adds up the potential urban and rural PV potential, it comes to over 20,000 gigawatts. And there's an additional, by the way, 60 gigawatts of rooftop solar potential that we didn't even talk about. If just 1% of this potential could be developed, just 1%, the solar PV capacity in the state would exceed 200 gigawatts, or almost 3 times the all-time ERCOT peak. And that's just 1% of the solar capability. In addition, solar PV produces the most energy at just the right time relative to load. Here's a chart showing a typical hot summer day load profile on the top, ERCOT load. That's a typical hot summer day with the highest generation or the highest load coming in the afternoon. The orange or red line, depending on what your screen looks like, is estimated solar production, assuming just 5 gigawatts or 5,000 megawatts of solar PV capacity, which is just 1/4 of 1% of the potential. And you can see that it's much more in line with the ERCOT load than is the wind profile, which in the summertime typically blows mostly at night and less during the day when it's most needed. So solar produces the most power when it's needed the most. And as temperature increases, air conditioning load increases, and solar PV production increases as well. But since solar PV is uncontrollable like wind power, how reliable is it, and can we count on it? We talked about these numbers before. ERCOT currently counts 8.7% of wind power capacity as being reliable. and they're considering increasing the wind power, the reliability factors to 14.2% for West Texas and 32.9% for the coastal wind. Solar PV is currently counted at 100%, and it will be until there is 200 megawatts of solar, which ought to be pretty quick. At that time, ERCOT will have to come up with a capacity value for solar as well. The National Renewable Energy Lab suggests a capacity value for reliability for solar in the range of 25% to 75%, or up to 8.5 times the current percentage of the wind value. And since the solar in Texas likely would be in some of the highest solar intensity areas in the country, it's probably closer to the 75% than the 25%. But nonetheless, because it's synergistic with load, solar will likely have a much higher capacity value. Now, this is information that came from the Brattle report. They did a study for the Solar Energy Industries Association. You may have seen these numbers before, too, and it's just the emission savings and the energy cost benefit by using certain amounts of solar PV. And we talked a minute ago about 5,000 megawatts of solar, which would be a good bit, twice what ERCOT projects may be available in Texas or in ERCOT by 2022. We would avoid, as you can see, over 1.5 million tons of CO2, and it would produce about $500 million in cost benefit. And obviously, lesser amounts would produce lesser, and more would produce more. But significant savings from an environmental standpoint and from an energy cost standpoint in using solar. Now, ERCOT, as I mentioned earlier, has projected optimistically, their most optimistic scenario in their long-term assessment was that there would be 3% of the power, 2,300 megawatts or so, would be produced by solar in 2022. Well, I just want to point out the growth of wind against the standards, the renewable portfolio standards that were instituted in Texas. And you can see that in 2009 we had a standard of about 3,000 megawatts, but we actually ended up at almost 9,000 megawatts, almost 3 times as much, and most of this is wind. The next renewable portfolio standard was for 2015, and it said that we needed to have about 5,800 megawatts of renewables by 2015. Well, we passed that back in 2008. The current portfolio standard is to have about 10,000 megawatts in 2025, and you can see that we have already exceeded that in 2012, and the red line shows what is planned. Now, this is mainly wind, or in fact, it's almost all wind. But it just shows that with the projections or the standards that are out there, and again, the long-term assessment for solar is not a standard, but if we estimate it's going to be about 2,300 megawatts in 2022, it's very likely it could follow this same sort of pattern and be substantially more than that in 2022. So we'll see, but it's very likely that it could take a similar path. Well, to summarize, ERCOT needs a lot of new capacity. We could see that from the charts that we looked at the beginning. There's about 10,000 megawatts of wind in operation in ERCOT now in 85% of Texas. Only about 74 megawatts of utility-scale solar PV is operating, and there's none in the pipeline, none being at least contemplated in the short term. Texas has enormous solar PV potential. I mean, it's the Saudi Arabia of solar. So it is the highest value in the United States. Solar has a higher capacity value than wind. It's synergistic with load. Solar produces power right when it's needed. So it's a just-in-time product. And while it won't displace wind or conventional generation completely, I think it should be a significant part, and I think it will be a significant part of the energy equation for Texas and probably for the nation as well. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Great, Ron. This was just an excellent talk. And for those of you that have joined us since Ron spoke last fall, I learned a lot of new information. We have a lot of questions coming in. And again, chat your questions. Send to all panelists in the lower right corner. The first question from James. Any comments on effects of this RPS legislation attempts to drop completely versus adding a solar carve-out?
Well, there's a lot of activity going on right now. The only carve-out so far has been that 500 megawatts of the 10,000 megawatt RPS. Let me go back to that slide real quick. I'm sorry, it went too far. The 2025 standard is 10,000 megawatts. 500 of that has to be something other than wind. Doesn't necessarily mean, it could be biomass, doesn't have to be solar. So it doesn't specifically say it has to be solar. But that's the only carve-out that I know of. Now, there has been a bill introduced in the legislature to have a renewable portfolio standard that includes solar. It's in committee now. It's in the State Affairs Committee. Whether it will even emerge from committee, I think, is problematic with all the other issues going on in ERCOT. So I don't look for a renewable portfolio standard for solar coming out of this legislative session. Now we'll see. The session is just in progress now, and we'll see at the end of May if there is a bill that comes out. But one other issue I think that's important. The PUC, the Public Utility Commission, has not indicated a great deal of interest in talking about solar with respect to dealing with the capacity situation, the resource adequacy situation that we're dealing with. However, just recently there have been a number of comments filed in the resource adequacy docket. This is the docket that is considering what the PUC should do about resource adequacy. There have been a number of comments, including a relatively long filing by the Butler Law Group, and then some supporting filings that followed that are asking for a workshop to consider why solar wouldn't be part of the resource adequacy solution. So there's a lot of interest out there. Now we'll see what the PUC does with respect to that. They have the right to either say, fine, we're going to have a workshop or not. So it's up to them. But the solar continues to come up as a potential solution for this, and again is the subject of a bill in the legislature that I have doubts will emerge as a passed bill, but is in committee currently and has certainly not been defeated at this point. So we'll see.
Okay, great. And a note for the audience, I just chatted to all participants a link that we have in July after this year's Texas legislature session is over. Russell Smith from TRIO will be presenting the actions of the Texas legislature. You can also find in our archives an overview that he gave in December of last year. So, Ron, the next question, I'm combining two questions. It was about your slide 8 comment that there was a 36 megawatt battery storage in West Texas. Was that for wind power storage and then released during peak load times? And the follow-up was, is storage essential for solar PV to play a significant role in supplying the grid?
Well, the 36 megawatt battery storage is almost an experimental deal. It's in No Trees, West Texas. But obviously, since it's pretty much all wind out there, any use of that battery storage at this point would be to support the wind. However, with 10,000 megawatts of wind and 36 megawatts of batteries, it's not going to have a significant impact. However, it's a start. In order to be able to utilize large amounts, that is a large percentage of either wind or solar, there's going to have to be some sort of backup. That is some sort of reliable generation, more reliable, controllable generation, say natural gas-fired combined cycle or quick start combustion turbines that can supply the load if, in the case of the wind quits blowing, or in the case of the sun, the sun quits shining. So there's going to have to be some sort of backup. Now that backup could be some sort of storage, batteries, compressed air energy storage, pumped hydro. There's lots of ways that it can be done, all very expensive, by the way, but it can be done. But I think even without that, especially with solar, because it is synergistic with load, we can rely on solar to a great extent, not completely. Now, I think what these questions contemplate is relying on solar for a very large percentage of our power. And for that, it would be very difficult. We'd have to have some sort of storage to take us through the nighttime hours. But certainly, a lot of solar can be used during, or can be made available, or is available during the day when the loads are the highest.
Okay, thanks. We had a question on slide 7. Was all of the production drop from 2011 to 2012, or I guess all of the demand drop, was all of that due to the difference in weather, or was there any efficiency gains in Texas, and how much did the population economy grow during that year?
You're talking about, okay, okay. This slide that I've got up now, I guess.
Yes. 6.
Okay. Well, the primary cause of the drop in generation, or in the load that was served, that is the ERCOT Energy, was simply weather. It was because 2012 was the hottest summer on record, whereas 2011 was a more normal summer, and so it's just simply a function of weather. I don't think that it is a function of any sort of demand response, nor is it a function of efficiency in that short period of time. Obviously, over time, generation resources become more efficient. Combined cycle, for instance, as it becomes a bigger part of the generation portfolio, is about 30% more efficient than other forms of generation, and so that efficiency will change. But it takes time for that to happen. So really, the impact or the difference between 2011 and 2012 was almost completely due to the difference in weather between the 2 years.
Okay, and this is a perfect follow-up. I think it was a question on slide 11. Can you describe what ERCOT does when you said demand response, and maybe define demand response for our audience?
Okay, I'm not sure which slide. My slide numbers are a little bit different, but
I think it was on slide 11. You were talking about addressing the capacity reserve margin, and there was an option on demand response.
Okay, yeah.
If you could just define demand response and what ERCOT is thinking of doing.
Well, demand response is simply when loads get high enough and prices get high enough because of high loads, then customers can quit using power or use less power. That's simply demand response. In other words, demand gets high, customers respond by lowering their demand. Sometimes there are situations where they get paid to do that. Primarily large industrial customers get paid to reduce their loads if ERCOT gets into a position where they need more power and more power isn't available except from load. So there are a number of ways to do that. One of the ways it's been used for some time in ERCOT is called load acting as a resource. That is, it's a load that will respond to increasing demand by reducing its demand. In effect, it's just like a generator, but instead of adding new generation to increase the demand, it drops the demand to match the existing generation. So there's that. And then there is the hope that if you had a real-time pricing scenario, that is, if customers would know if prices for power were to change throughout the day depending upon loads, and customers had that pricing available to them, they could then make a decision about whether or not they wanted to use power in that period of time or how much power to use, and therefore reduce their demand. So there are a number of ways to accomplish demand reduction or demand resource reduction, and some of them are in play right now. And the PUC is looking at, in this case, in this slide, it says the Emergency Response Service Pilot. At least that's the slide I'm looking at. That's one of the commission actions. And it's just simply going to pay customers, generally fairly large customers, for reducing demand in emergency situations, and pay them at basically the system price at that time. So if the system price rises very high to a very high level because of excess of demand over supply, then these customers would get paid a good bit amount of money to reduce their demand or shut down their factories or their shops or whatever was producing was using the power. Now this morning again, the Public Utility Commission met on demand response. I'm not sure. I have not seen the webcast yet, but they were looking at some of these issues. So we'll see where that comes out. But I think demand response at this point, at least to this point, has been a relatively small part of the solution. Right now, probably less than 2,000 megawatts is involved in all sorts of demand response, including load acting as a resource. And you might increase that some, but in order to handle the additional 1,300 megawatts that we're going to need every year, it's doubtful that we could come up with 1,300 megawatts of demand response every year for the next 10 years. So while it is a part of the solution, it certainly is not the complete solution.
Okay, great. Another question from Richard. At the State Affairs Committee yesterday, one of the legislators was concerned about the large amount of water that is required to clean solar panels. And so Ron, can you address this concern and maybe in context of how much water is required by alternative natural gas and coal plants?
Right. Well, I mean, all power plants require water of some sort. Wind turbines probably less than most, or almost none. But coal plants, nuclear plants, gas plants, all require huge amounts of water, both for cooling and for the production of steam. So they use and turn into steam significant amounts of water. However, there's this belief that solar panels you have to have a big water truck going by and watering these things all the time. Well, that's one way to do it. That's one way to clean the solar panels. However, you may be aware that we have a couple of rovers. NASA has a couple of rovers on Mars, and they're run by solar panels. One of those rovers quit working because the solar panels were covered with dust from a dust storm. Well, so NASA pretty much gave up on that rover. Surprisingly, not too long after that, another windstorm came up on Mars and blew the dust off of those solar panels, and that rover began working again. So it's not just water that can be used to clean solar panels. Perhaps we can use air or wind or fans or some other method. But nonetheless, water is a big issue in Texas, as you probably know. It is one of the big issues at the legislature. What do we do about water resources in Texas? And so the less water we can use for the production of power, the better off we are. And I can tell you that solar will use, even if you do wash the panels with water, will use a much, much smaller amount of water than conventional power technologies. Again, the only technology that I know of that may use a little bit less or almost none at all is wind. And you know, you can only have, we've already got a lot of wind, and it is not synergistic with the load. So it's really not the resource that will solve all of our needs. I guess in summary, solar could use some water, but it will use very little comparatively.
Great. The next question, I think it was on slide 21, which was showing the solar generation curve and wind generation curve both at the time of day. This question was, they assumed that solar generation curve was for optimum tilt and orientation with time of day. see, I think it was slide 21, yes, here.
Yeah.
So if you tilted your solar panels westward to match the load curve, do you know how much production you would lose versus the optimum tilt and orientation? So I guess it's saying instead of maximizing your solar production, what if you tried to match solar production to demand? How much production capacity would you lose? Do you know that?
I'm not sure. I almost think we've got the question a little bit backwards. I believe that this solar profile is for panels that are not movable. I believe this is for fixed panels. Now I'd have to look at the NRAL study to make sure, but I believe that that's the case. This is so if you tilted the panels, that is, if they were sun-following panels, then you would pick up the front end of that curve around the 8, 9 o'clock would actually rise more quickly, and the end would drop a little bit later. But the middle of the curve would be essentially the same. So what you do is you pick up some amount of megawatts on either end of the peak in the early morning and in the late evening or late afternoon. But the peak would still be the same, because that 5,000 megawatts, that would be the rated capacity of the panels if they were facing directly into the sun.
And I got a follow-up to that, clarification. So he meant if it was a fixed tilt panel, but you tilted it westward instead of rotating.
I think that this is a fixed panel.
Okay.
And so if you tilted it, I think it would actually improve it. Now, I apologize if I'm wrong. If there's a tilting panel, as I recall, this is a fixed panel. But if it was a tilting panel, then it would just simply cut off. If it's a tilting panel and you move it to fixed, it would just simply reduce it a little bit on the front end and on the back end, but it would not change the center of the curve. It would just reduce the total amount of megawatts or kilowatts produced under that curve.
And there was a comment from James in our audience that in Austin they incentivize solar panels to be westward facing in order to optimize afternoon generation. So it sounds like at least in Austin they actually are doing that. So thanks for that comment. We had another question from Jim, and let me see, I might need to get some clarification from him. Will solar farms be viable considering some obstacles and restrictions found in other states, specifically New Jersey and Maryland, the collapse of the SREC markets in those states, and the expiration of the Farm Security and Rural Investment Act? So I guess he's wondering about the viability of solar farms given how things have progressed in New Jersey and Maryland, where SRECs have dropped in some cases 90% of their value.
Well, the case in those areas is the reason that there was a lot of solar development in those areas is because of the incentives that were available. And the incentives, one would argue, may have been a little bit too aggressive, and so they're just backing off now that they've got a whole lot of applications and a whole lot of solar facilities. If you looked at the map of solar intensity, New Jersey was not the most solar intense place in the U.S., as you can imagine. So while there is certainly incentives, federal, state incentives will help and would speed the development of solar, they are not, in my view, because the value of solar or the price of solar is coming down so rapidly. That is not going to be an obstacle to solar over the medium to long term. The prices are coming down so fast that it is already competitive with a number of generation resources and will be more competitive as the years go by. In the case in the rural area, in the urban areas up in the Northeast, obviously there are some opposition to some amount of solar. It does take up some space. If you've been to West Texas, however, you can see that there is just a whole lot of space that is available for solar panels. There really is nothing there at this point. Very little, no farming essentially in many areas, and very little else. And so that's one reason wind has become so popular out there. The wind turbines just about everywhere, and the same could be true for solar. It would be a good use of the land out in West Texas, and I doubt that there'd be much argument in general. You may have some specific areas where there would be some opposition, but I doubt that there'd be much at all. For one thing, again, the wind has sort of forged the path out there, and so people understand the value of that area of the country in producing power in so far in wind and eventually in solar.
Okay, and if we have time for one more question, it was on slide 12, I think. It was asked if you could repeat a definition of capacity market versus an energy market, and maybe provide an example of how a capacity market would function, financial incentives, and things like that.
I'm not sure what slide that is, but let me go back
here.
Slide 12
well, okay. Is the note I had made.
Okay. Okay, capacity market, energy market. This slide has down at the bottom. A capacity market is a market in which, well, let me back up just real quick. I'll try to do this real quickly. Before deregulation, before the electric system was deregulated, back in case of Texas in 2001, utilities had the responsibility to plan to meet load. So if they knew that the load was going to be a certain amount in 5 years and they needed to add 2,000 megawatts of generation, it was their obligation to do that. They had to add that 2,000 megawatts of generation so that when the time came, they would have adequate generation to serve the load. Well, with deregulation, that what's called obligation to serve disappeared. There was no longer any obligation to serve. And so we adopted an energy market. Some areas that deregulated, such as the Northeast primarily, the upper Midwest, they developed, when they deregulated, a capacity market that operates very much like the old regulated market. And the way that operates is that the entity that runs the area, in this case ERCOT, would look out ahead and see we need, by 2022, we need another 10,000 megawatts or however much it is. Then they'd go out for bids for people to build this generation, and they would pay them to do that. In other words, they would, the developers, the builders of the generation would get paid in advance of that generation running. So it's very much like the old regulated system in that regard. So it's a capacity market in that there is a process by which new generation is forecast. They go out for bids for people to build that new generation. It's built and it's there in time. In an energy market, on the other hand, there is no capacity component. So the prices, the idea is as energy gets scarce, or as the capacity gets scarce, as there's more demand, less supply, that the developers see that, prices rise up, rise high enough that developers build a plant to supply that need. Obviously, when they build that plant and put it into service, the power prices would probably go down because there's less difference between supply and demand, and you go through the same cycle. So it's an up and down, more up and down cycle. The feeling in Texas was that a capacity market is more of a market, a true market, in that an energy market is more of a true market, whereas a capacity market actually has that non-market capacity component where you're paying people for power that's not being produced, actually paying them in advance. And so that's the difference. Texas is the only energy-only market in the U.S., and the other markets, California, the New York ISO, ISO New England, the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland interconnection, all of those have capacity components, and none of those have worked as intended completely. Whereas the capacity component is intended to incent people to build new capacity. In some cases, people have taken capacity out of service and then later on bid it back into service. Same capacity, same power plant, bid it back in under a capacity market in order to get a guaranteed return for it, which is not the intention. So Texas has resisted a capacity market because it is a non-market, is an out-of-market solution. So I hope that tells you the difference. But it's a big issue. a big issue in Texas, whether or not to go with the capacity market. And essentially, the way I read it, the chairman of the PUC favors a capacity market. Commissioner Anderson, who's one of the commissioners, does not. And there's only those two commissioners. The third one, Pablos, resigned March 1st, and the governor has not appointed a new commissioner and won't until at least June 1st. And so we really have a commission that is in disagreement about that. I don't think there's going to be any decision to create a capacity market anytime soon. Certainly not in the next year or so, and probably not unless we have another summer like we had in 2012.
Okay, great. I think we've taken care of all the questions, and we've also just about run out of time. We had a note from Richard asking me to please encourage the listeners of this webcast to contact the Texas State Affairs Committee members and ask them to listen to this recorded webinar. And I provided a link to find information about this committee that you can go to if you would like to, if you live in Texas and you would like to encourage your committee member to learn more about it. And Ron, I can't thank you enough for this. I learned a whole lot, and it seems like there's been a lot of progress made just since the about 5 months since we heard the last presentation. I have posted some links to download Ron's white paper from last year on this subject. Also, we will have the recording available for this webinar within about 24 hours, and I posted that link as well. And all registrants will receive an email with this link when that is ready. That will be about tomorrow at 11 a.m. Central Time. And Ron, did you have any parting thoughts?
No, I just thank everybody for listening. I know there's a lot of there are a lot of issues. There was a lot of maybe some technical jargon that we talked about, and I apologize for that. It's a complicated issue, and it's one that's going to be with us for some time to come. But again, we have some outstanding opportunities to help resolve the situation. One of them being